That night, the police stormed the house of a drug dealer on the outskirts of the city and found in the basement something none of them expected. In the corner of a dirty concrete room, under a single dim light bulb, 3 small creatures were huddled together: a tiger cub, a lion cub, and a bear cub. They were emaciated to the bone, infected with parasites, and barely breathing. Even as they were dying, they did not let go of each other. They lay in one tight bundle, as if this alone was helping them stay alive. Help was needed immediately. The dispatcher called 5 veterinarians on duty, and all 5 refused to go at night to a dirty basement to treat confiscated wild animals. Then he called me. I was an intern with only 3 months of experience, and when the dispatcher described what was happening, I was already putting on my jacket. I arrived 20 minutes later, went down the stairs, and turned on my flashlight. All 3 of them raised their heads at the same time. 3 pairs of frightened, cloudy eyes looked at me from the darkness, but they were alive, and that was the most important thing. The bear cub was in the worst condition. The owner had put a collar on him when he was very small and had never removed it. As a result, it had grown deep into his flesh, and the skin had begun to close over the straps. The senior veterinarian told me over the phone to wait until morning, but I looked at the bear cub again and realized that I could not simply watch the dying baby and do nothing. I put down the phone and took out a scalpel. The operation lasted 40 minutes. While I was working, the lion cub and the tiger cub lay quietly nearby and watched me. They did not whine or move. They simply watched, as if they understood that I was trying to help their brother. When everything was finished and I had bandaged the bear cub, he immediately crawled back to the other 2 and lay between them. All 3 closed their eyes almost at the same time. I stayed beside them for another hour, simply watching, and even then I understood that life with these 3 would not be easy. Over the next few weeks, I visited the wildlife shelter every day, and each time I saw the same thing. No matter what I was doing, they were always together. When I placed an IV for the tiger cub, the bear cub and the lion cub lay pressed closely on both sides and did not move until I finished. When the lion cub ate poorly and I tried to feed him by hand, the other 2 moved closer and placed their heads beside him, as if encouraging the little one. When the bear cub slept longer than the others after the operation, the tiger cub and the lion cub simply sat nearby and waited for him to open his eyes, never leaving. I had never seen anything like this before between animals of different species. On the 3rd day, the shelter management tried to separate them, which was a standard procedure, with each species placed in a separate treatment area. The bear cub was taken away first, and within a few hours, the 2 remaining cubs stopped eating and began making sounds that I could only describe as grief. In the bear cub's enclosure, a staff member said that he was lying in the corner and was not responding to anything. I went to the director and said directly that if the bear cub was not returned to the others immediately, we might lose one of them by morning. The director sighed and agreed. When I brought the bear cub back and placed him between the other 2, all 3 calmed down within a minute. They simply closed their eyes and began to breathe evenly. From that moment on, the question of separating them at the shelter was never raised again. The problem was something else. The shelter was not designed for the permanent care of 3 large predators, and a few weeks later, the management announced that a licensed place had to be found within 2 weeks. Otherwise, the animals would be transferred to government institutions separately. I had no license, no land, and no money. Only a video that I filmed on the day it became clear that separating the cubs was impossible. I posted it online without expecting anything special, and by the next morning it had been viewed by several million people around the world. Among those millions was one prisoner who had neither a phone nor internet access. He watched the video over the shoulder of his cellmate, and when he recognized the 3 animals, he clenched his teeth and abruptly turned away from the screen, making his cellmate flinch. But at that time, I still knew nothing about him. Then Harris called me, an elderly owner of a large ranch hidden in the forests, a reclusive and quiet man, the kind who could go for years without seeing his neighbors and not consider it a problem. He said that he had a valid license to keep wild animals, 200 acres of land, half of which was forest, and that he had long needed a full-time veterinarian. His ranch was too far from any town, and very few veterinarians were willing to travel there, while he had horses and goats that required constant veterinary care. We both got what we wanted. He gained a veterinarian who lived nearby, and I gained a place where the 3 cubs would not have to be separated. I agreed, even before he finished showing me his property. When we brought them to the ranch and opened the transport crates, the tiger cub was the first to step out. He took a few steps on the grass, lowered his nose to the ground, and froze for several seconds. Then he slowly raised his head and looked toward the forest. The others followed and stood beside him. The 3 cubs remained almost motionless for about a minute, looking in one direction, as if they had only just realized that there were no cages, no walls, and no basement ahead of them, only forest stretching to the horizon. Harris stood beside me, watching them and saying nothing, which was completely normal for him. If only I had known then what awaited us. During the first months, I was getting used to my new life. I woke up at dawn, checked on Harris's horses and goats, and then went to see my 3. One day, Harris silently took some boards and tools, and within 2 days, built a large shelter for them next to the house on the forest side. It was simply a roof supported by thick posts, open on all sides, with a thick layer of hay spread on the ground. He did not explain anything and did not expect gratitude. He simply built it and went about his business. At that moment, I realized that this reclusive old man knew how to care for others. He just did it without unnecessary words. About 6 months after that night, my 3 already felt like the true owners of the ranch, and they did something that I would later remember with a smile. I went to the city on business and returned a few hours later. The kitchen door was wide open, the refrigerator stood open and completely empty. A shelf had been torn off the wall, and jam was smeared across the floor. The bear cub was lying on his side in the middle of the kitchen, so full that he did not even lift his head when I entered. The lion cub was sitting on the table and looking out of the window with the expression of a creature that had ended up there purely by accident. The tiger cub stood in the corner, methodically chewing on a cardboard butter package. When I approached, all 3 slowly moved to a far corner, sat close together, and stared guiltily at the floor. The bear cub carefully placed his large paw on the tiger cub and gently pushed him forward, clearly pointing to the main culprit of this mess. I stood in the middle of the devastated kitchen, looking at this mischievous trio, and for the first time called them by their names aloud: Baloo, Simba, and Shere Khan. They raised their heads and looked at me. At that time, the cubs were not yet like their famous namesakes, but they still had everything ahead of them. Harris later said that a lock should have been put on the refrigerator on the very first day. I installed one the next day. A week later, Shere Khan opened it himself. Over time, the line between my work and my life with the 3 became almost non-existent. They were often nearby while I took care of the household. Baloo followed me around the yard like an important assistant. Simba lay in the shade observing everything, and Shere Khan appeared and disappeared silently, as only tigers can. At night, they always returned to the shelter and lay down together, always the 3 of them, as if it could not be any other way. Harris watched all of this silently, and one evening said that his land had not felt so alive for a long time. For a reclusive man who had lived alone for years, this was almost a ceremonial speech. A year after that terrible night, something happened that made them true celebrities. I took Harris to the city on business and returned closer to the evening. All 3 of them were sitting inside the cab of his pickup truck. Baloo was behind the wheel, his paws resting amusingly on the steering wheel. Shere Khan was in the passenger seat. Simba was sprawled in the back with a look as if everything around him had long and rightfully belonged only to him. Harris looked at his truck for a long time in silence, then said with a sigh, "I just washed and filled it up yesterday." I took out my phone and filmed my inseparable trio. Within a few days, the video gathered tens of millions of views, and their photos appeared in the news outlets around the world. The same cubs who, a year earlier, had barely been breathing in a dirty, damp basement had now grown into magnificent predators, beautiful, large, and full of life. Among those who watched this video in a prison recreation room was that same prisoner. Now he knew not only that the inseparable animals were alive and well, but also roughly where they were located. All that remained was to wait for his release. About a year and a half after that night, something happened that finally convinced me that we had found each other for a reason. It was late September. I went alone to the stream and slipped on a whetstone. My ankle twisted, I fell, and immediately realized that I would not be able to stand up on my own. My phone fell and broke. I was wearing a light jacket, and in late September, it gets dark early and cold quickly near the stream, especially when you are lying motionless on damp ground with a broken ankle. Shere Khan looked at me and ran away. He simply turned and disappeared among the trees without even looking back. Lying on the wet ground, I thought that when things became truly bad, he simply left. It hurt so much that I was close to tears, but the other two did not abandon me. Simba silently lay down on one side, Baloo on the other, and I found myself between them wrapped in their living warmth, which drove the cold away almost instantly. Darkness was falling. An hour passed, then another. Eventually, I stopped keeping track of time and simply lay there waiting, not knowing for what. Suddenly, I heard the cracking of branches and saw the beam of a flashlight. Later, Harris told me that he had arrived home at dusk and saw Shere Khan sitting by the porch, clearly waiting and judging by everything for several hours. When Harris got out of the truck, the tiger jumped up and ran toward the forest. He would stop, look back, make sure the old man was following him, and then run ahead again, while Harris struggled to keep up with him using a flashlight. When they reached the stream and Harris saw me between Simba and Baloo, he silently took me by the arm. However, we both understood that the old man alone would not be able to carry me back to the house. Simba seemed to understand this as well and simply moved close to my other side without waiting for any command. I placed my hand on his back, and we slowly made our way toward the ranch. I walked between the old man and the lion, barely moving my injured leg. And as we went, I realized that they had just saved my life, each in his own way, and exactly when it was needed. About 2 years after our first meeting, in the middle of the night, a loud noise came from the direction of the chicken coop, so loud that Harris and I jumped up at the same time. In the years before my arrival, Harris had lost several dozen chickens to coyotes. The predators came regularly, bold and hungry, and no fence could keep them away for long. That night, when we ran outside with flashlights, the pack, 9 or 10 animals, was already inside and did not even look in our direction, as if 2 people with flashlights did not exist for them. Harris raised his rifle but did not shoot. He understood that even if he managed to shoot 1 or 2, the hungry animals could attack us, and then we would not survive. At that moment, the 3 of them suddenly emerged from the darkness, silently, without a single sound. Baloo stood up to his full height on his hind legs at the entrance to the chicken coop. In the darkness, he looked like a massive boulder that had suddenly risen from the ground. Simba moved forward low and slowly, and the roar he gave was not something I heard with my ears, but felt deep in my chest. Shere Khan approached from the side, cutting off the bold predator's path back to the forest. The coyotes saw them and vanished into the darkness within seconds, their tails tucked like beaten dogs, as if they had never been there. Harris lowered the rifle, which had not been needed, and looked at the 3 of them for a long time. Then he said that over all these years, he had probably lost 100 chickens to those creatures, and now he had the best protection anyone could imagine. He added that he regretted only one thing, that they had not been there earlier. About 2.5 years later, a veterinary inspection arrived to visit us. 3 officials in uniform with the senior inspector holding a thick folder. Officially, it was a routine inspection of the conditions in which the wild animals were kept. However, from the very first minute, it was clear that they had not come just to complete a formality, but to find a violation. They methodically checked everything: licenses, documents, records, and medications, and found questions about every item. Harris and I answered calmly because everything had been properly arranged. The inspector grew gloomier with each passing minute. When all the paperwork had been reviewed and no formal complaints remained, he demanded a visual inspection of the animals. Since they moved freely around the territory, he asked us to call them. I asked, "Do you really want that?" He looked at me with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and repeated that yes, that was exactly what he wanted. I shrugged and whistled 3 times, a special signal known only to the 4 of us. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Baloo emerged from the forest. Standing on all 4s, he reached the inspector's chest in height, broad as a wardrobe, and moving slowly. Behind him came Shere Khan, enormous and silent, moving so lightly that the ground seemed not to feel his weight. After him came Simba, with a heavy dark mane reaching his shoulders. He looked at the inspector as if looking at empty space. All 3 stopped a few yards away and simply waited. The inspector froze. Then Baloo took a step forward and slowly began to rise onto his hind legs. The inspector stepped backward toward the exit without taking his eyes off the bear. Feeling for the folder under his arm, he opened it without looking, stamped it, and said in an even voice, without raising his eyes, "No violations found. Everything is in order. We apologize for the disturbance." He got into his car and drove away without stopping. Harris watched them leave and shook his head. The inspector had not even taken a photograph of the animals for the report. We both found this strange, but quickly forgot about it. On that very same day, in another place, prison gates clanged open. A grim man was released after 3 years of imprisonment. He paused at the threshold, squinted against the bright light, and smiled slowly and unpleasantly, like someone who had had plenty of time to think. Harris and I had no idea of his existence. He, however, knew everything he needed to know about us. A few weeks later, one morning, I was walking toward my inseparable trio with food when I suddenly froze in place, as if struck by an electric shock from within. All 3 stood before me, and I saw them as if for the first time in my life, not as my own, not as the little cubs I had known from the beginning, but simply as 3 wild animals in the full strength of their prime. Baloo, standing on his hind legs, seemed to block half the sky. Shere Khan was larger than any horse on the ranch and moved as silently as a house cat. Simba looked at me with the calm and confident gaze of a creature that had long had nothing and no one to fear on this land. I suddenly remembered that terrible night in the basement. 3 dying bundles of fur clinging to each other with their last strength. And now they stood before me, huge and alive. And after 3 years, they remained just as inseparable as on that first night. Then Shere Khan approached and gently pressed his forehead against my chest, just as he had done when he was a kitten and could only reach my knee. I exhaled and sat down right on the grass, and all 3 lowered themselves beside me, Simba on my right, Baloo on my left, and Shere Khan resting his head on my knees. It was a beautiful morning. That night, I was already lying in bed and almost asleep when strange sounds outside woke me. They were not animals or wind, but something metallic and dangerous. I stepped onto the porch and in the darkness saw a truck at the gate with its headlights turned off and 2 armed men beside it. A third man stood apart, looking directly at me. I recognized him immediately, even though I had only seen him in a photograph from an old case. It was the same drug dealer from whose basement the 3 unfortunate cubs had been rescued 3 years earlier. He was smiling. I tried to close the gate, but the leader nodded to one of the men, who stepped forward and pushed me so that I fell to the ground. The leader bent down toward me and said maliciously, stretching every word, "I tried to take them legally. I even sent an inspection here, and everything turned out to be in order. Well then, I will take them by force." He straightened up and walked deeper into the property, his men following him, while I lay on the ground thinking that I was completely alone and that Harris was in the house, probably sleeping soundly. Then, from the darkness, a sound was suddenly heard, low, steady, and growing louder. Simba appeared first, moving slowly and calmly, stepping directly into the faint beam of light from one of the men's flashlights. He simply walked out and stood there, and all 3 bandits immediately turned toward him. 2 of them raised rifles with tranquilizer darts, while the leader confidently placed his finger on the trigger of a real firearm. A massive lion standing 30 feet away is something you cannot take your eyes off, and you think of nothing else. That was exactly what Simba intended. While they were focused on the lion, Shere Khan silently emerged from the darkness at their side. They neither heard nor saw him. In the next second, the tiger was already beside the leader and, with a sharp strike of his paw, knocked the rifle out of the man's hands. The weapon flew into the grass and disappeared into the darkness. The man cried out and jumped back in shock. The other 2 turned toward the sound, and at that moment, Baloo rose behind them. Standing on his hind legs in the darkness, he towered like a huge living nightmare. The bandits clearly did not expect to encounter such a large predator. The 2 men with the tranquilizer rifles stared at him, frantically calculating in their minds. Each of them had only 1 shot, and even if both darts struck the bear at the same time, he would not collapse instantly. That is not how it works with an animal of his size. And while he would be going down, the lion and the tiger were waiting nearby. No one dared to move. The leader slowly looked at the rifle lying in the grass. It was about 6 feet away from him, and suddenly lunged toward it. But Simba, who had been standing still the entire time and seemed to be merely watching, moved faster. With a single leap, the lion reached the rifle and placed his huge, heavy paw on it, leaving the bandit with no chance. The leader glared at the lion, at the paw, and at the rifle beneath it, then slowly straightened up. It was over. Harris came out of the house. He had heard everything but waited for the 3 to do their part, and he already had his phone in his hand. Calmly, he took the tranquilizer darts from the 2 bandits, approached Simba, who lifted his paw, picked up the firearm, and called the police. Baloo, Simba, and Shere Khan remained in their places until the police arrived. They did not growl or attack. They simply stood and stared intently at the bandits, and that was more than enough. When the leader of the bandits was being handcuffed, a police officer turned to me and said that for armed robbery with unlawful entry, this man would receive a far more serious sentence than for animal smuggling, and for the next 10 years he would pose no threat to anyone. I nodded and looked at the 3 of them. Baloo had already dropped down onto all 4s and was yawning as if the night had been completely ordinary. Shere Khan sat watching the police cars drive away, and Simba approached me and gently pressed his head against my shoulder. In the morning, I sat on the grass. Shere Khan lay beside me with his head resting on my knees. Simba was dozing a couple of steps away, and Baloo was snoring at my feet. Harris brought coffee, sat down next to me, and we remained silent for a long time, watching the sunrise spread across the grass. Then he said, "You always dreamed of working as a veterinarian in a large clinic." I looked at Baloo, at Simba, at Shere Khan, at this forest and this sky, and replied, "My dream has come true, even better than I ever imagined." Harris nodded and said nothing more, and that said everything. Then all three of them stood up, stretched, and slowly walked toward the forest, Baloo in front, with Simba and Shere Khan walking side by side behind him, just like on that very first day, when they had stepped out of their cages and stood together, looking toward the forest, as if they had always known that this was their land and had finally returned home. They did not look back, but soon they came back, as they did every day, as always, as if they had never left.